So how do we actually do the embedding of dynamic intelligence into organizational strategy? How do we ensure that it moves beyond an individual skill and becomes an organizational capability? And this is where the dynamic intelligence development system comes in. And that's what I'm going to briefly cover next. Understanding dynamic intelligence is one thing. Embedding it into leadership, teams, and organizational culture is quite another. The dynamic intelligence development system is a structured, step-by-step approach to ensuring that dynamic intelligence doesn't just remain an individual skill, but becomes an integral part of how your organization operates. And because the dynamic intelligence development system is such a mouthful, I'm going to refer to it either as DIDS or the framework from here on in. So before we can develop cognitive complexity, we need to measure where we are today. The first step in the framework is to assess the dynamic intelligence of leaders and teams. This matters because organizations often assess diversity in demographics, but not in thinking capability. Understanding dynamic intelligence levels helps identify gaps in decision-making agility, bias awareness, and inclusive leadership potential. One key method we use in DIDS is to introduce dynamic intelligence assessments into leadership evaluations. We might also analyze team decision-making patterns to identify where bias or rigidity is limiting inclusion. And we might also identify high potential leaders with strong adaptability for targeted development. Assessment isn't about labeling, okay? It's about understanding how people think so that we can develop them effectively. Once we understand where our leaders and teams are, the next step is to develop their cognitive complexity through dynamic intelligence development. This matters because, as we've already discussed, traditional DEI training often focuses on awareness without shifting actual decision-making behaviors, whereas dynamic intelligence development is designed to reshape cognitive patterns, ensuring that inclusion becomes a habitual way of thinking, not just an ideal. And this can be implemented in a number of ways, such as providing dynamic intelligence-based leadership development, using real-world case studies and decision scenarios to develop cognitive flexibility, and implementing coaching and peer feed-forward loops for reinforcement. Development isn't a one-time event. It's about equipping leaders and teams with a new way of thinking, one that sustains itself over time. So development alone isn't really enough. To drive real change, dynamic intelligence should be embedded into the systems and processes that shape organizational culture. If hiring and promotion decisions are made through the same cognitive filters as before, organizations will continue to reinforce existing biases. Embedding dynamic intelligence ensures that inclusion is not just a leadership trait, but a structural advantage. And this can be achieved by incorporating cognitive complexity assessments into hiring and promotion criteria, aligning leadership development programs with measured dynamic intelligence growth, and integrating dynamic intelligence principles into organizational strategy and decision-making frameworks. Inclusion doesn't happen by chance. It happens when we design for it. When dynamic intelligence principles are built into the way decisions are made at every level of the organization. So the final stage is ongoing, ensuring that cognitive complexity doesn't stagnate. It's got to evolve alongside the organization. Because inclusion isn't a fixed state, it's a continuous process. Organizations that treat diversity and inclusion as a one-off initiative fail to create lasting impact. So to avoid this, establish dynamic intelligence learning communities where leaders engaged in continuous development. Use real-time feedback systems to measure the impact of dynamic intelligence on leadership and team dynamics. And reinforce dynamic intelligence through ongoing executive coaching, peer mentoring, and adaptive learning programs. When dynamic intelligence becomes part of an organization's culture, inclusion is no longer an initiative. It's simply how business is done.